So greetings, one and all. Welcome to the Art of the Ages. I'm your host, Paul Lytle. So we are going to talk a little bit more on the practical side, just a tad, and talk about swoopers and bashers. So for those of you who have not heard these terms, I believe that Kurt Vonnegut coined these terms when he's talking about two different types of writers in his book Timequake. Now, I was absolutely floored by this concept when I read Timequake. I think I mentioned in a previous episode that I have been quite a big Kurt Vonnegut fan. Now, that is not to say I recommend everything he's ever written, and Timequake is not one of those things I actually recommend. I had hoped to, like, when I was coming back to this concept, I was looking it up to see. It's like because I read a lot of Vonnegut like all at once, and I couldn't remember where this book was, where this passage was from, and so I had to look it up, and I saw it was Timequake, and I'm like, darn it, Timequake! I got rid of that book a long time ago. But this was something that was very worthwhile in it. So we're talking about our styles of actually the writing process, and so and this is specifically on how we get words on the page. So what Vonnegut tells us is that swoopers are people who will just get words down and edit heavily later. So, and for you bashers out there, when you hear about like a Michael Crichton writing 10,000 words a day, it's probably bewildering to you. Well, this is how this is done. You write. Swoopers just write, and a lot of times swoopers know that, well, this passage is not really working, but I'll fix it later. Nothing to be done with it right now. Let's get it on the page, and we will fix it later. Bashers are the exact opposite. Bashers have to fix it now, and have to get it right now. Now, there's certain advantages and certain disadvantages to each one, obviously. The first draft, the swooper gets the first draft out like really, really fast. But the editing process is normally very, very, very long and very difficult, because you get to passages that you realize that you had just kind of really passed over very quickly. I am a swooper, just for the record. And I remember actually it was the Eighth Power. So the Eighth Power is a book that's available, and actually a series of books that are available. So when I was writing it, there were passages that I wasn't at all sure on, and so what I did was I wrote down some nonsense, and I actually used the highlighter in Word to highlight this passage as a reminder. Hey, future Paul, this is a bunch of hooey, and you're going to want to fix that at a later date. Which was really funny because so what eventually happened was I started publishing the Eighth Power, which you will not be surprised has a total of 8 books in it, and I started publishing because I had already written them, right, and I had and so I was just trying to edit them and get them out, and they're pretty short books. So what I decided to do was churn them out like publish them once a month to over 8 months, and I had recalled that I had already given it a really good pass through, editing wise, and I was going to do maybe 2 more. And so, I gave myself a couple months head start and started just churning through them. And then I was the publishing schedule was slowly catching up on my actual editing thing. And then I hit like the later books, which I realized had not gotten a good once over. And those highlights were still there. I was frantically trying to piece that stuff together. It didn't help that the books, the rough draft had actually been written quite a bit earlier, but it's a real tangent. But this is the life of a swooper. You get back to a text, and a lot of times it just does not at all make sense. As another example, actually the first. I'd say the first good book I ever wrote, because I wrote some books in high school that were really, really terrible. But the first good book I wrote, and I have not published it yet, and I'm hoping to give it another good once through, and get it out there. But I remember finishing it, and it was the longest book I had ever written at that point, and it was 70,000 words. The stuff I'd written in high school were hovering around 50,000 words, but this one's 70,000 words, so it's significant improvement. And I've edited it through a few times since then. I just pulled it up just for fun to see what the word count is. It's 152,000, so it's like literally twice as long as the original draft. But that's kind of that's being a swooper. That's the most I've ever edited a book, but that sort of very long editing process is pretty typical. So what the basher does instead, and I've known a few bashers, and their ways bewilder me, and I could not understand it until actually I read this quote from Vonnegut, and then it was like, oh, okay, all right, I understand now. Bashers need to get it right, and so they will hammer away or bash away at a sentence until it's right. And so the first draft is a lot more intensive and a lot more time consuming than a swooper's first draft, but the editing process is a breeze after that because it's mostly right. So you might need to change a few things, you might need to correct a few things as you go, but mostly it's done. And so there might be some minor stuff that you go back and hit up on, but otherwise it's pretty good. I bring this up because I do think it's actually helpful for us to know what kind of writers we are, and that there isn't really a right way of doing that. One of the most freeing quotes I've ever read was by fantasy author Tracy Hickman, who co-created the Dragonlance Dungeons and Dragons setting, and he was talking about the writing process, and he was talking about how it's like just sometimes you just know it's not working. It's not flowing right. It doesn't matter though. Get it on the page. Fix it later. Get it on the page. And this was reading this was like hugely liberating for me because I was hitting that wall early on as a writer that was like I wasn't feeling it, and so I would stop. It's that kind of writer's block type of a thing, right? That, oh, well, okay, it's just not going to come today. Like, this is just some mystical force that, well, we tell ourselves exist, but, back then that's like, okay, well, it's just not working today. And then when I read that, then it was very freeing because it was just like, okay, well, just keep going. Let's see what happens. Let's keep going. And typically that I would start getting the flow down. I'd start getting the rhythm down. I would start, being able to really kind of shine. And so like going back in the editing process, I'd see these like passages that are just garbage that I'd really just have to redo. But then it would settle down, and I would go to a prolonged segment that was after the first, 15, 20, 30 minutes of writing, a more prolonged segment that was really, really quite good. And so that was very helpful to me. But I can't sit here and in this podcast say, just do that. All right. Now, I mean, I've said it in a previous episode. It was like you need a schedule, and you need to be writing something during that schedule. Now, a basher might approach that a little bit differently than a swooper would. A basher might approach that schedule and like writing just a terrible sentence and then just hammering away at that sentence until it works. But as you get better at that, as you get more used to that, you're going to find that you're going to get it right more often the first time or the second time. A swooper like me might have a segment that is going to be just garbage, but it's going to even out, and then the garbage segments are going to, as you get used to it, as you exercise that muscle, are going to get fewer and farther between. But in a writing podcast, I can't just simply say, "Hey, do what I do," because I'm a swooper, and you might not, and you might be a banger. A basher. I bring that up right now because we've just finished. If you're listening to this as it comes out, we've just finished National Novel Writing Month, which is ridiculously designed for swoopers. It's like the whole point of it is in the month of November is to write a 50,000 word novel. Well, for swoopers, that's fine. We're going to spend the next year editing this piece of garbage. For bangers, that's a little bit more difficult, right? And so I've known a lot of people like in not realizing what kind of writer they are tried to, just emulate someone else's approach, and it doesn't work. And so that's when you're setting up goals for yourself, when you're setting up your schedule, when you're trying to figure out how you're going to approach something, the first thing you need to know is what kind of writer are you? Because, a goal for a swooper is probably going to be much higher word count per day. We're going to churn through a first draft much more quickly, and so then part of that goal setting process then is going to be setting a long editing tail at the end of that is going to go on ad infinitum. But if you're a basher, then you're going to want to adjust those goals. So the word count per day might be a lower goal, but so your first draft schedule is going to be much longer, but the tail on it is going to be much, much shorter. There's not really a right way or a wrong way to do that. It's honestly, what do you prefer? I certainly can write like a basher can. But I don't enjoy it nearly as much, right? And so I don't. I enjoy churning out that first draft and then hammering away at the rewrites and hammering away at the editing. And then sometimes just, bloating that thing on up until it's twice the original size. That's kind of how I approach things, because that's how I prefer to approach things. So figure out which way you like better, and then you can go. You can set your goals with that in mind. As for what kind of goals you should be setting, well, I mean, obviously that's going to depend on your schedule. It's like I used to have very high writing goals, and now I am, a husband and a father. My writing goals are much more modest these days, and so there's not really a right or wrong way to do that either. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish and what time you're trying to accomplish, and is that realistic? But we're going to probably talk more about all of that stuff in a future episodes. In the meantime, I really do thank you for joining me in this episode of The Art of the Ages, and we will be back next week. The plan right now is to just keep going through the through the Christmas holidays and into next year, and so hopefully we'll have some new content for you next week and each and every week after that. In the meantime, never, 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 never stop telling stories to one another. Thank you again.